This was my third Tinder date of the month, the same script repeating itself, the same quietly disappointing reality unfolding again. Ryan, or maybe his name was Tyler, was still going on and on about his cryptocurrency investment portfolio, while I nudged a few sad strands of pasta around my plate, like a bored machine running out of battery. I wondered why I kept circling back to this ridiculous loop. Dating apps full of ordinary men and conversations so dull they felt like invitations to fall asleep. I am Dr. Leighton Hayes. My job is to save lives, to wrestle patients back from the edge of death every single day, and yet somehow I am completely powerless when it comes to rescuing my own love life from the steady parade of forgettable men, the kind who look far more promising through a screen than they ever do when they are sitting right in front of me. I was moments away from pretending to take an emergency call from the hospital just to escape this date when a server rushed toward our table, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear as he cried out, asking if there was a doctor in the room because they needed help immediately. I stood up without hesitation, instinct rising through me like a switch being thrown. Tyler looked at me with irritation, as if I had just interrupted something profoundly important about his thoughts on the decentralized financial market. I didn't bother responding. I simply followed the server quickly down the hallway toward the private dining room, and when the door opened, I walked straight into a moment that would alter the entire course of my life forever. The private room was a scene of chaos. Chairs knocked over, glass tumbling across the floor, tablecloths twisted and scattered as if a small storm had torn through the space. Two men in black suits stood frozen beside a long white draped table, their faces stiff and bloodless like carved stone. An older woman lay motionless on the floor, her silver hair fanned out around her like a pale cloud, the warm light above casting a soft glow over a face that no longer moved. But what made me pause for half a heartbeat was the figure of a man standing at the head of the table, his back to me, tall, broad-shouldered, his entire presence radiating a coldness so sharp I didn't need to see his face to understand he was dangerous in the kind of way grown women know instinctively they should never approach. He didn't move, yet his presence alone made the room feel as if time itself had tightened around its edges. In that brief sliver of a moment, I had no idea I had just stepped into the world of a man who would break every rule I had ever believed in. If you're still listening and something in this story has brushed against a feeling inside you, take a moment to subscribe to our channel, like and share this video so we can continue bringing you heartfelt stories every single day. And if you don't mind, tell me where you're watching from. Leave a comment below and let us know which corner of the world this story has traveled to. We truly cherish every word you share with us. My body reacted before my mind had the chance to think, my knees hitting the cold floor as I rushed to the side of the motionless woman. I placed 2 fingers against her carotid artery, waiting for even the faintest beat, but there was nothing except silence. No pulse, no breath, cardiac arrest. I shifted into position instantly, lacing my hands and pressing down hard in the center of her sternum, each compression firm, steady, deep enough to matter but not so forceful that it would shatter more of her fragile bones than necessary. Someone behind me let out a panicked cry before clamping a hand over their mouth, and the 2 men in black suits hovered just a step away, frozen in place, unwilling to touch anything. I heard someone sobbing, a glass rolling another small circle across the floor, but every sound faded as adrenaline flooded through me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Compression steady, fast enough to keep blood moving. I tilted her head slightly, lowered my ear to her mouth and nose, searching again for a breath, but found only the same cold stillness. I opened her airway, inhaled deeply, and delivered 2 slow, strong breaths, enough to lift her chest. Then I went right back to compressions. My whole body felt hot, yet my hands kept their rhythm. I didn't have time to look at anyone, but I could feel the man at the head of the table watching me, his gaze sharp, and nothing like the look of someone desperate for a loved one to live. It felt more like a cold, bottomless assessment, as if he were studying every movement I made to decide the fate of the entire room. I couldn't afford to be distracted. Compress again. My breaths grew shorter, but my hands stayed steady. I pushed down harder, feeling the faint crack of aging ribs giving way beneath my palms, but a broken rib was better than letting her heart stay still a moment longer. 1, 2, 3. I gave 2 more breaths and continued compressions. A server stammered out a question asking if we should call for an ambulance, but my voice cut sharp through the panic, driven purely by instinct because time was the one thing I could not afford to lose. Call now. She's in cardiac arrest. I'm keeping her alive. Move. My hands ached, my shoulders burned, but I didn't stop. And then suddenly, beneath my palms, Her body convulsed violently. My heart jolted. A harsh, ragged gasp tore from her throat, the sound of air forcing its way into starving lungs. It wasn't gentle. It was the desperate, terrifying sound of survival. Her back arched off the floor, and she coughed, a wet, rattling sound that shook her entire frame. Her eyes flew open, wide and unfocused, blind with panic. She didn't see me. She didn't see her son. She simply clawed blindly at my wrist, gripping it with bruising force as her chest heaved, fighting for every molecule of oxygen. "Stay with me," I commanded, my voice cracking, keeping her upright to clear her airway. She didn't answer, she couldn't, but the pulse under my fingers hammered back, chaotic but strong. I pulled my hands back, gasping for air, sweat sliding along my temple. When I lifted my head, I met the man's eyes for the first time. Dark, fathomless, dangerous enough to send a chill down my spine, yet eerily calm, like a lake moments before a storm breaks. Something had shifted in the room, and I knew I had stepped into something I was not prepared to face. He moved toward me slowly, unhurried, untouched by the chaos surrounding us. He knelt down, bracing one hand on his knee as he looked at the woman's face more closely, then lifted his gaze to mine. His voice was low, steady, carrying a weight that made me forget I was still trying to catch my breath. "You just saved my mother." The wail of the ambulance siren outside the glass doors felt like the room itself was being pulled out of a nightmare. 2 paramedics rushed in, taking over the airway and attaching monitors to the chest of the woman I had just brought back. I stepped aside, drawing in a long breath to steady myself, my hands still trembling from adrenaline and the weight of the past few minutes. They lifted her onto the stretcher, secured the straps, and wheeled her through the stunned silence of the restaurant staff. I managed only a brief glance after them before I felt his presence approaching. Roman DeLuca stood in front of me, not close enough to breach my space, but not far enough for me to breathe comfortably. In the dim amber light, his face came into sharp clarity. Harsh lines, eyes shadowed the way a man's eyes look when he has witnessed too much, the posture of someone accustomed to command and obedience. He slipped a hand into the pocket of his suit jacket and drew out a business card. It was pitch black, so dark it swallowed the light, with nothing but his name embossed in a thin silver whisper. Roman DeLuca. No title, no office, only a short string of numbers below. He held it out to me, his fingers long and utterly still, and something about the gesture made it feel like he was offering me something dangerous. I hesitated as I took it, my skin brushing his fingertip, and a cold shiver rippled through me so sharply it raised every hair on my arms. When I lifted my gaze, his eyes met mine directly. They were dark, deep as nightfall, sharp as a hidden blade wrapped in velvet, not hurried, not soft, just intensely observant. The look of a man who sorted people into 2 categories, useful or not useful. I didn't know which one I was, and that uncertainty made my pulse trip in an uneasy rhythm. "Thank you" was all I managed. He didn't answer at once. He simply watched me for one more heartbeat, long enough that my skin felt fevered despite the cool room. Then he turned away, his voice low and steady, spoken with the quiet certainty of a man issuing conclusions rather than promises. "I will contact you." By the time he left, it took me several seconds to remember where I was standing in the middle of a restaurant, breath uneven, the air still carrying the faint mix of expensive cologne and the salt of my own sweat. The restaurant manager hurried over, his face pale, his voice shaking like someone who had just escaped disaster. "Ma'am, your entire dinner has been paid for." I blinked, surprised. "I don't know." "Who?" He swallowed hard. "The man who just left. Your whole meal. And the bill for your guest as well." I pressed my lips together, caught between disbelief, discomfort, and a disorienting sense of connection I didn't want. But here, it seemed I was no longer the one making decisions. I stepped out of the private room and returned to the table I had abandoned along with my terrible date. The chair across from mine was empty, his wineglass half drained. The check placed neatly between them. Next to it, my phone buzzed. A message. "You took too long." I exhaled slowly, unsure if I should feel disappointed or relieved, perhaps a little of both. I grabbed my purse and walked out of the restaurant, and as I stood on the curb waiting for a taxi, something made me turn my head. Not far away, beside a sleek black SUV, Roman DeLuca stood leaning casually against the door, hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed directly on me as if he had predicted each step I would take the moment I left that room. No wave, no signal, just watching. A look that chilled my spine and sent my heartbeat stumbling out of rhythm. When the taxi pulled up, I opened the door quickly and climbed in, but I couldn't stop myself from glancing back one last time. Roman was still there, unmoving, as if to remind me that the moment I dropped to my knees to save his mother had not been an ending at all, but the first tightening of an invisible thread looping itself quietly around the two of us. 2 days later, while I was signing off a stack of medical charts at the nurse's station, the entire hospital suddenly filled with a rush of hushed voices and hurried footsteps, the kind that signal an unusual emergency. I looked up just in time to see a nurse sprint past with a terrified expression, followed by the tense, clipped voice of hospital security speaking through a radio. "There's a convoy of unfamiliar vehicles outside the main entrance. Black cars. A lot of them." My heart dipped, a cold unease spreading through my chest like a draft sweeping down a long hallway. I stepped closer to the glass doors and looked out toward the front of the hospital. Under the pale, early afternoon sun, a line of sleek black SUVs stretched across the curb like the set of a crime thriller. Men in suits fanned out into formation, earpieces tucked in their ears, eyes scanning the crowd with sharp, unwavering vigilance. And at the center of them, Roman DeLuca stepped out of the lead car. He wasn't wearing a suit jacket like the night at the restaurant, just a dark, long coat, yet his presence carried the same gravitational pull. The people in front of him parted instinctively, clearing a path without a word, every gaze drawn to him as if caught in his orbit. I swallowed hard, tension climbing my spine like a wire pulled taut. I knew everything had gone far beyond ordinary the moment I saw my department chief standing still, staring out the window with a mix of curiosity and fear. No one else knew he was here for me, but I did. Clearly enough that my hands trembled when he entered through the main doors, his gaze sweeping the room and landing on me without hesitation, as though he had tracked my exact position long before stepping inside. His guards moved with silent coordination behind him, and the hallway went so quiet I could hear the shallow breath of the young nurse standing beside me. Roman stopped in front of me, close enough to command attention but not close enough to touch, yet the space around us tightened, as if the entire floor had shifted its focus. His voice was low, cool, pared down to essentials. "My mother has asked to see you." I drew in a slow breath, trying to keep my face steady. "Is she doing better?" He gave a small nod. "Awake, and very insistent. You saved her life. She wants you to come to Long Island for a follow-up, to ease her mind." The way he spoke did not resemble a request. It felt more like an order wrapped in a thin layer of civility, and I knew refusing would trigger a confrontation I had no desire to provoke. Yet a small part of me, the part that still remembered the moment Gloria opened her eyes, felt this was not unreasonable. But the way he had arrived like he was taking possession of the hospital left me momentarily speechless. I tried to gather my voice even as I heard the tremor in it. I'm on shift. I can't just leave." Roman tilted his head slightly, as if I had said something illogical. "I already secured permission for you." I blinked. "Permission? From whom?" He didn't smile. He simply stated it as if it were the most obvious truth. "Your department chief approved your temporary leave for today." My pulse hammered in my ears. I turned toward my chief, who stood a few paces away, avoiding my eyes as if he had nothing to do with any of this. I wanted to protest, but the words lodged in my throat. I understood then that I was dealing with a force that did not wait for the word no. Roman watched me for one more silent moment, making sure I understood, then turned down the hallway toward the door. "Come with me." I hesitated only a fraction of a second before my legs began moving on their own, drawn forward by an invisible pull. People stepped aside, the hallway so silent that the sound of my shoes tapping against the floor felt too loud. When we reached the parking area, one of the SUVs swung its rear door open, revealing a dark, pristine interior polished to a mirror-like sheen. Roman stood beside it, leaning slightly, his expression carrying a patience I knew would not last very long. "Please." I inhaled deeply, feeling my stomach tighten as I stepped inside. The door closed behind me, and as the vehicle pulled away from the hospital, I realized that this trip to Long Island might take me into a world I had never imagined I would enter. The car carried me out of the city, past the high-rise skyline, and deeper into the quiet edges of Long Island, where stone-paved roads and long rows of ancient trees opened into an entirely different world. We turned onto a private drive so long I couldn't see where it ended, flanked by classic lantern posts that cast soft golden light over perfectly trimmed hedges. When the SUV finally stopped before the DeLuca estate, I found myself holding my breath. The mansion rose like something lifted from a Renaissance painting, blue-gray roof tiles, pale stone walls, towering windows reflecting the fading evening light, all of it elegant yet cold, the kind of place where every brick seemed to hold secrets never meant to be spoken. The front doors opened before I even reached them, and Maria, the elderly housekeeper, greeted me with a smile as gentle as a breeze. Her warm voice eased something tight in my chest, though the air inside the house made me more alert than relaxed. The marble floors gleamed. A grand spiral staircase climbed toward the second floor like something out of an old Italian estate, and rich-toned paintings lined the hallways. There were no loud noises, only a disciplined quiet, as if everyone who lived here had long learned to silence even their own breathing. But when I was led to a spacious, dimly lit suite on the ground floor, the atmosphere shifted entirely. Gloria DeLuca lay in the center of a massive 4-poster bed, propped up against a mountain of white pillows. A cardiac monitor hummed softly in the corner, a rhythmic reminder of how close she had come to the end. She looked frailer than she had in the restaurant, her skin pale against the sheets, but her eyes were alert. The moment she saw me, she tried to lift her head, a weak smile touching her lips. "My dear, you're finally here," she whispered, her voice raspy and thin. She reached a trembling hand toward me. I moved instantly to her bedside. Taking her fingers in mine, they were cold, but the grip was surprisingly firm. "Please, sit," she breathed, nodding toward the chair Roman had placed next to the bed. "I apologize for the lack of a proper dinner. I'm afraid I'm not quite up for entertaining yet." I shook my head gently, keeping my voice soft. "Rest is what you need, not entertaining." I turned slightly and saw that Roman was already there, standing near the heavy velvet curtains, silent, still, like a sculpture carved from shadow. His hands were in his pockets, his dark gaze fixed entirely on me. I turned back to Gloria, trying to avoid that gaze, yet the more I tried, the more I felt it against my skin, heavy and unflinching. For the next hour, I stayed by her bedside. Instead of a dinner conversation, I monitored her vitals, adjusting the flow of her oxygen and checking the rhythm on the screen. Gloria talked freely, though her voice was weak, telling stories from her youth, stories about her garden, her late husband, and she sprinkled in gentle questions about my work, about Manhattan. I answered calmly, smoothing the blanket over her hands, trying to keep my focus professional enough to forget the truth that every time I checked the monitor or leaned in to listen to her breathing, I felt Roman watching. Not overtly threatening, but penetrating, steady, impossible to read, as though he were studying me one layer at a time. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but at moments I felt the air between us tighten like a wire, so taut that the slightest touch could make it spark. I tried to focus on Gloria, yet I was relentlessly pulled back into the silent gravity Roman created. Eventually, Gloria's eyelids grew heavy. "Having you here is the thing that comforts me most these days," she murmured, her eyes drifting shut as sleep finally pulled her under. Roman stepped forward from the shadows, his presence suddenly filling the space beside the bed. He looked down at his mother for a moment, his expression unreadable, then shifted his gaze to me. "She's asleep," he stated, his voice low enough not to wake her, but deep enough to vibrate in the quiet room. "I'll have someone drive you home." I nodded, my heart slipping off its steady beat for reasons I couldn't name, fear, or something more dangerous that I refused to acknowledge. When I stepped through the front doors and the cold night air hit my face, I could still feel his gaze on my back like a faint, smoldering imprint I couldn't erase. And as the car carried me away from the estate, I sat in the dark, my chest tightening with a strange, conflicting pull, the instinct to run far away, and the equally strong pull of the man who had barely spoken, yet filled the entire evening with a quiet, dangerous chemistry I was no longer sure I could resist. That night, I returned to my small Manhattan apartment in a dazed, half-awake state, still carrying the sense of being pulled into an invisible current Roman DeLuca had created with nothing more than a few silent glances. I tried to convince myself that the dinner had been nothing unusual beyond a grateful mother and a controlling son. But when I stepped out of the shower and walked into my bedroom, my phone vibrated, the screen lighting up with a name that stalled my breath. Roman. I stared at it for several seconds, ready to let it ring out, but some instinctive, inexplicable part of me made me answer. His voice came through low, slow, and quietly commanding, even through the phone. "Dr. Hayes, my mother wants you to become her private physician." I responded immediately, almost reflexively, telling him I couldn't, that I had a full-time job at the hospital, that I wasn't the right fit for that kind of position. But Roman was not a man who accepted simple refusals. He fell silent for a few measured beats, long enough for me to feel the weight of his restrained patience pressing through the line. "You are the one she trusts. I need you here." I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm grateful, But I can't leave the hospital. And I don't want to be involved in... I didn't finish, but I knew he understood. This time he didn't push. He only spoke one brief line, soft as wind, but carrying the force of an unspoken command. Think about it. Then he hung up, leaving me alone in the dark room with a heartbeat pounding as if I'd run miles. I tried to sleep, but around 3 a.m, a sharp, tightening pain spread across my chest, jerking me awake. Not a heart attack, but that familiar acute clenching born from too much anxiety. I braced my back against the wall, breathing through it until my pulse steadied. And then my phone buzzed again. A message. From Maria. Please come. She's having chest pain. I didn't lose a single second. I grabbed my coat, jumped into a taxi, and headed straight for Long Island. When I entered the estate, everything was wrapped in a quiet so heavy it felt unnatural. Maria met me at the door, worry etched across her face. Gloria was seated in a small sitting room, one hand pressed lightly to her chest, her complexion pale but conscious. I assessed her immediately, checked her pulse, asked about her symptoms, took her blood pressure, and quickly determined the pain wasn't cardiac but muscular, likely from stress and disrupted rhythms after the shock of recent events. I reassured her, prepared medication, and gave Maria a list of things to watch for. And when I turned around, Roman was there. He stood resting against the doorframe, arms crossed, his gaze dark and long enough to spill like a shadow into the room. No questions, no dramatic worry, just watching. Watching me the way someone studies the smallest movements, the smallest breaths, the smallest emotions rising under the skin. When I finished writing the orders, he stepped forward. His voice dropped even lower, so deep it felt as though the room itself tightened around us. You see now, she needs you. I gripped the pen in my hand. I told you, I can't. I didn't get to finish, because he stepped closer, close enough that I felt the faintest brush of his breath near my temple. Not threatening, but not persuasion either. Something in between, dangerous, inexplicable, causing my hands to tremble no matter how hard I tried to hide it. Roman spoke slowly, clearly, each word tightening around me like a loop. I'm not hiring you to break rules or bow to me. I need you here because you are the only one I trust not to harm her. He paused, and his eyes sharpened in a way that sent a cold shiver down my spine. And because I protect what is mine. He did not touch me, yet the words ran down every bone in my body, making me want to step back, yet holding me completely still. I had to swallow hard before my voice returned. I'll think about it. His gaze eased, but not entirely. Good. The cottage is already prepared for you. I froze. He had planned this beforehand? Roman tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes revealing nothing and everything at once, as though he knew with certainty I would follow the path he had already laid. And as I walked out of the room, my heart beating out an uneven rhythm down the long hallway, I realized tonight was not only about Gloria, it was about Roman, and that my refusal, no matter how I phrased it, had never truly held any power with him from the very beginning. I moved into the cottage on a fog-softened morning, when Long Island was still wrapped in the gentle chill of early spring. The small house stood tucked behind a row of towering elm trees, its gray tiled roof and wide glass windows opening toward the garden and back. Everything felt too quiet, too perfect, too much like a place that had been prepared for me long before I ever agreed to come, exactly the way Roman had said the night before. I set my small suitcase down on the pale wooden floor, feeling as though I had stepped into a world I wasn't sure I belonged to. But the 3 a.m. phone call, Gloria's pale face, and Roman's low, unyielding voice still clung to me. I knew I couldn't walk away while she needed me. I was placing a few belongings onto the shelves when a knock sounded at the door. Not loud, not urgent, just enough to make me turn. Roman stood there, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a cup of coffee, as if he had simply wandered over by chance. But nothing about this man was ever accidental. His eyes swept over the half-arranged room and then settled on me. You settling in? I nodded, trying to keep my voice calm. I'll stay, but I have some boundaries. One of his brows lifted slightly, a hint of amusement flickering there even though he said nothing. I drew in a breath. I don't work for your family beyond caring for Gloria. I won't be involved in anything else you're doing. I don't take orders from anyone except my patient, and I don't... I hesitated, then finished. I don't want to be treated like something you own. Roman didn't react immediately. He just stood there looking at me, long enough that I could hear my own heartbeat. Then he nodded. All right. Relief loosened something in my chest until he gave a slow, sharp smile, the kind that made me feel like a child declaring rules we both knew I wouldn't keep. I agree to all your boundaries, Dr. Hayes, but his voice dropped, warm and heavy with a truth I could almost feel against my skin. I also know you'll break them before I do. Heat rose along my neck, though I said nothing. Roman set the coffee on the small table by the door and stepped back, giving me room to pass. She's waiting for you? Then he disappeared down the stone path leading back to the main house, leaving me in the quiet with the faint scent of coffee and a sentence that felt more like a prediction than a warning. When I entered the mansion's sitting room, Gloria was curled into a wingback chair by the window, wrapped in a knitted shawl, her eyes bright with the delight of someone receiving a long-awaited visitor. When she saw me, she lifted both hands as if reaching for a daughter. "You really came." I laughed softly, a small wave of relief warming me as I sat beside her. Gloria took my hand, her palm surprisingly warm. "I knew you'd say yes. Roman seems far more at ease knowing you're here." I bit my lip, unsure how to respond. She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing playfully even as her voice stayed gentle. "He doesn't say it, but I know the woman who has his attention is always someone rare." My cheeks flushed at once, uncertain whether she was teasing or had brushed too close to something I was trying hard not to think about. I quickly shifted the topic to her health, checking her pulse again, reviewing her medications, asking about her meals. Gloria chatted happily, the room softening with a kind of warmth that made her seem stronger just by having someone close. And perhaps what surprised me most was that for a few moments, I felt normal, safe, even as if this was the work I had been meant for all along. When I left to return to the cottage, I saw Roman standing at the end of the hallway, his posture still, his gaze steady, as though he had been there watching for quite some time. I tightened my grip on my bag and walked past him without looking too long. But his voice followed me, low and even, stopping me despite myself. "Your cottage locks automatically. If you need anything, call." I didn't answer, only nodded. Yet as I stepped through the garden path toward where I now lived, a truth pressed quietly against me. Those boundaries I had set down that morning were already shifting, trembling at their edges. And Roman had known it before I did. The days that followed passed in a strange kind of peace, as if the DeLuca estate existed inside a sealed pocket of quiet so delicate that a single touch might shatter it. Every morning I cared for Gloria, taking her blood pressure, reviewing her medications, monitoring her heart, then staying a little longer just to listen to the small, vivid stories she told about her garden, about raising 3 boys in a house too big for its own silence, about Roman as a child, who rarely smiled but always stood in front of his mother like a shield. Gloria opened up to me more with each passing day, and I found myself looking forward to those mornings. But what I never grew used to was Roman. He never entered a room without knocking, never broke any boundary I had set, yet every time he appeared, I felt the air pull tight around us. Sometimes I'd be writing down Gloria's readings and look up to find him standing in the doorway, silent, as though he had been there long enough to memorize every detail. Sometimes I'd be talking with Gloria, and he would suddenly appear behind her chair, not saying a word, just resting a hand on her shoulder as a greeting, but his gaze lingering on me far longer than necessary. Once, as I carried tea out to the garden, I turned to head back to the cottage and found him standing on the gravel path, hands in his pockets, watching me with a look that made my heartbeat falter. He never crossed a line, but it was that very restraint, that silent, heavy presence that kept my guard constantly raised. And that night, the quiet storm finally touched me in a way I could never have anticipated. I was reading through Gloria's chart in the small sitting room of the cottage when a knock sounded. I opened the door and nearly lost my breath. Roman stood there, his dark shirt torn at the shoulder, blood streaking down his arm. A jolt went through me. "What happened?" He answered with a calm so steady it felt unreal. "A little trouble." I pulled him inside instinctively, closing the door behind him as if I were hiding something from the world. Under the warm cottage light, I saw the gash clearly deep across his shoulder, blood trailing in narrow lines, not life-threatening but serious enough. I spread out my medical kit on the table and motioned for him to sit. He sat without a sound, watching me with eyes darker than I had ever seen. I reached to peel back the torn fabric, and when my fingertips brushed his skin, the muscles beneath tightened. I flinched, but forced myself to focus, cleaning the wound, preparing the sutures. Roman never looked away. Every time I lifted my head, his gaze met mine steady, waited, as though he were reading thoughts I had never voiced. "This is going to hurt," I warned. His answer was a low vibration that seemed to run straight through my spine. "I can handle it." I stitched carefully, each pass of the needle slow and precise. But every time the metal pierced his skin, his breath shifted. Not from pain, but from the closeness between us. We were too close, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body brushing my wrist. Close enough that if I leaned just slightly, my forehead would graze his cheek. Each stitch pulled the air tighter. Each breath felt as if it reduced the room by another inch. When I finished and cut the thread, he spoke quietly. So quietly I almost thought I imagined it. You save people even when no one asks. I didn't know how to respond, so I focused on wrapping the bandage. But when I finally looked up, he was still watching me, unhurried, unforcing, yet close enough that my body didn't know whether to step back or move toward him. I whispered, barely audible, "I'm just doing my job." Roman tilted his head, his dark eyes casting a dangerous, unreadable shadow over me. "No, Leighton, this isn't just a job anymore." I forgot to breathe for a moment, and in that brief, breathless silence, with night pressing against the windows and his warmth brushing the edge of my skin, I realized the storm I had been trying so hard to outrun had already begun inside me. That afternoon, I received a call from an unfamiliar number while I was reorganizing the medicine cabinet in the cottage. The woman's voice on the other end was so frantic it made me straighten instantly. "Dr. Hayes, this is the head nurse from the nearby clinic. Mrs. Gloria DeLuca is here showing severe chest pain, and we can't reach her family. Please come immediately." My throat tightened. Gloria never left the estate without someone accompanying her, but fear for her heart left me no room to question anything. I said I'd be there in 10 minutes and rushed out the door. I took a taxi to the address, but the farther we drove from the residential neighborhoods, the more something felt wrong. The road leading toward the old industrial district was darker than it should have been. The building where the driver dropped me off looked like an abandoned warehouse, a steel door half open, half jammed. No sign, no lights. I tried calling the number back, but it only buzzed with a busy tone. A pulse of dread climbed my spine. But if Gloria was truly here, if she was having chest pain, I couldn't walk away. I pushed the metal door open and stepped inside. The air was icy, heavy with the smell of old metal and dust thick on the concrete floor. I called out, "Is anyone here?" But my voice echoed and dissolved into the emptiness. When I turned to leave, the steel door slammed shut behind me with a shriek of metal that jolted me to my core. Then the darkness swallowed the room whole. I didn't even have time to react before a force slammed me to the ground, cold cement knocking the breath from my lungs. A rough hand clamped over my mouth, the smell of leather and metal filling my nose. I clawed, kicked, tried to break free until a man's voice whispered at my ear, freezing my blood. "Don't scream. I won't hurt you if you cooperate." The hand loosened, but before I could shout, a cold blade touched my collarbone, stopping me mid-breath. I was yanked upright and tied to a worn wooden chair. A flickering neon light sputtered to life, casting uneven pools of light across the room. 3 men stood in front of me. I knew none of them, but the way they looked at me made my heart contract. One stepped forward, his face sharp-edged, brown eyes clouded with hatred. "You're the doctor who treats the DeLuca woman, aren't you?" I swallowed hard. "What do you want?" He smirked. "We want Roman, and you're gonna call him here." A tremor ran down my arms, but I forced my voice not to break. "He won't believe it. No one would believe a call from a place like this." The man tilted his head. "Then we'll make you convincing enough that he does." The 2 behind him approached. Holding my phone, they'd taken it from my coat pocket. My breath turned quick and shallow, but I made myself stay calm. If I let panic win, I'd lose my ability to think. One of them held the phone close to my face. "You'll call Roman and tell him you've had an accident. He'll come." I shook my head, gathering the last of my courage. "If you think using me will pressure him, then you don't understand." He cut me off. "Oh, I know exactly what kind of man he is. He'll slaughter this whole district just to get back what he wants." My stomach twisted, the image of Roman sitting in my cottage while I stitched his skin flashing through my mind. Yes, that was exactly who he was, and that was exactly why I had become the perfect target. I inhaled slowly, anchoring myself. I couldn't let them panic, but I couldn't let Roman walk into a death trap either. I needed time. I lifted my chin and looked straight at the man with the knife. "If you really want to use me as leverage, keeping me alive will be far more useful than threatening to kill me. I'm a doctor. I know how long I can last in this condition. If you go too far, I'll be dead before he gets here." He froze for a moment, narrowing his eyes. He hadn't expected this kind of resistance, but we both heard the tremor in my breathing. I wasn't strong. I was terrified, so terrified my limbs had gone cold. But fear made my mind razor sharp. He gripped my chin, forcing my face up. "You're braver than I expected. I hope you stay that way when Roman sees what's coming." My fingers dug into the edge of the chair until the sting shot up my palms. For a moment, I couldn't hear anything they were saying, just a single echo rising in my mind. Roman will come, and everything will get worse before it gets better. I felt the darkness curling in around me. But one truth was clearer than any fear. If Roman DeLuca realized I had vanished, he would burn this entire city to the ground to find me. The first footsteps I heard weren't from the men who had taken me. They were heavier, sharper, echoing across the concrete like a drum announcing something unstoppable drawing near. The kidnappers jolted, one of them rushing to the door to peer through the crack before turning back pale as ash. "He's here," he whispered, his voice strangled in his own throat. In that suspended moment, every sound seemed to vanish. I could hear my heart hammering so fast it hurt. Then the metal door exploded inward, slammed open so violently it struck the wall like cannon fire. Men in black suits flooded into the warehouse, moving with the precision of soldiers trained to advance, never retreat. Laser sights swept through the room, gunfire cracking through the air with a force that made the concrete vibrate. The world flashed in red bursts, everything around me flickering like a slow-motion scene in a film. One of the kidnappers lunged for me, dragging my chair sideways to use me as a shield. I screamed from instinct alone, but the gunshots swallowed my voice whole. And then, above the chaos, a voice cut through the air, low, sharp, deadly as a blade. "Let her go." I didn't need to look to know it was Roman. That wasn't the voice of a man searching for someone. It was the voice of a furious god, a storm made flesh, tearing through the world simply because someone dared touch what was his. The man holding me pressed the knife hard against my throat, the cold steel burning my skin. He shouted, his voice breaking with fear, "Back off or I kill her." Roman stepped into the light, not rushing, not afraid, but with a darkness in his eyes that chilled the entire room. Dust clung to his coat. Red flashes from the laser sights strobed across his face, deepening the shadows that already lived there. I had never seen him like this, not the controlled, silent man I knew. This was the true Roman DeLuca, the version of him who surfaced only when someone threatened what he cared for. Another kidnapper charged, but Roman's men took him down in seconds, the sound of impact slicing through the air. Roman took one step forward, his voice dropping to a low, almost whispered growl that filled the entire room. "If she spills a single drop of blood, I'll wipe out your entire bloodline." The man holding me trembled violently. I felt his grip falter, and in that instant, one of Roman's men struck from behind, locking his arms, wrenching the knife loose. I pitched forward, the chair tipping, but I never hit the ground. Strong arms caught me. I lifted my head just enough to see Roman. His face was carved in shadow, but his eyes burned with a light that made everything inside me narrow to him alone. "Leighton." His voice broke into a low note I had never heard from him. "I thought I lost you." He pulled me against him, arms tightening as if letting go would make me disappear. I shook, not from fear, but from the overwhelming feeling of being found, being protected by a man the world feared, but who was looking at me as though I was the one thing that could break him. His breath hit my hair, ragged with fury he hadn't released. He cupped my face, his hands strong yet trembling slightly as he searched for injuries. I tried to say something to tell him I was okay, but only fractured breaths left my throat. Roman turned toward the remaining kidnappers, his gaze so sharp I almost heard it cut the air. "Take them outside. Not one of them dies. I'll deal with him myself." His men dragged them off with the casual force of men hauling away bags of trash. Roman helped me to my feet, draped his coat around my shoulders, then lifted me effortlessly into his arms as though I weighed nothing. I rested my head against him, hearing his heart beat fast, uneven, a sound I never expected would make me feel safe. As he carried me out of that shattered warehouse, one truth settled deeper than fear. The moment Roman found me wasn't just the moment he saved me. It was the moment he revealed the truth he had never spoken aloud. I mattered to him more than any boundary I had ever drawn, and from that moment forward, I knew nothing between us would ever be the same again. Roman brought me back to the estate in silence, not the kind that feels distant, but the kind stretched tight like a thread ready to snap with the faintest touch. I was still trembling, still half trapped in the echo of that warehouse, the darkness, the cold concrete, the knife on my skin. My breath came short and shallow, my hands so cold I could barely feel my own fingers. When we stepped into the cottage, Roman didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't press me for details or demand explanations. Instead, he slipped his coat from my shoulders, set it aside, and turned on the lights. The warm glow filled the room, but my legs still felt weak, as if the fear hadn't fully left my bones. He looked at me for a long time, and that was what almost broke me. Not the violence, not the danger. But the way he looked at me, anger and relief and something sharp enough to be pain, all tangled together, as if he still couldn't quite believe I was standing there in front of him, alive. I sat at the edge of the bed, clasping my shaking hands together, and then Roman knelt in front of me. The most powerful man I had ever met, the man who had stormed into that warehouse like vengeance made flesh, was now on his knees before me, resting one steadying hand on my knee. "Leighton, look at me." His voice wasn't a command. It was gentle, almost pleading, a softness I didn't know he was capable of. I lifted my eyes, and his gaze locked onto mine, dark and deep enough to pull breath from my lungs. He brushed his fingers against my cheek, warm enough to melt the cold still clinging to my skin. His thumb traced a bruise along my jaw, and fury flashed in his eyes each time he found another mark. Finally, he spoke, his voice dropping into something rough. "If I had been a minute later, I would have lost you." My throat clenched. Heat stung my eyes. Maybe it was fear catching up to me. Maybe it was something else. Roman pulled me into his chest, his arms wrapping around me so tightly I felt his heartbeat slam against my ribs. He didn't say anything more. He just held me, as if that was the only way he could convince himself I was still here. When he finally eased his hold, his hand stayed on my face, his thumb brushing away a tear I didn't even realize had fallen. I trembled, just slightly but enough. And that was the moment when whatever wall I had left between us cracked. Not loudly, not violently. It fell apart in one soft, irreversible shift. Roman leaned in, his breath brushing my lips, close enough to make every nerve in my body tighten. "Leighton, if I kiss you now, I won't be able to stop." I knew. And I didn't pull back. If anything, I leaned in just enough to answer without speaking. The space vanished. His mouth met mine, not rushed, not brutal, but deep, devastating, consuming in a way that made the edges of the world dissolve. It wasn't the kiss of a man chasing desire. It was the kiss of a man who had almost lost me and found me again in the same heartbeat. His hand slid around my waist, pulling me onto his lap, his mouth moving against mine with a need that was both fierce and unbearably tender. Every trace of the warehouse, the fear, the darkness, the knife burned away. There was only his heat, his breath, his hands holding me like he had no intention of ever letting go. I don't remember who reached for the bed first, only that when my back hit the sheets and he hovered over me, the look in his eyes made my heart crash against my ribs. "If you change your mind, you say it now." His voice shook just barely, but enough for me to feel it, and that trembling made my hand rise to his face, pulling him down to me. "I'm not changing my mind. Not tonight. Not after everything." His mouth claimed mine again, this time without restraint, and the storm that had been simmering between us finally broke loose, raw, fierce, desperate, and threaded with the quiet terror of what could have been lost. Later, when I lay in his arms, his breath warm against my neck, I realized a truth both terrifying and inevitable. I had let Roman DeLuca in deeper than any boundary I had ever drawn, and the most dangerous part wasn't that the line had been crossed. It was that I didn't regret it. Not even for a moment. The next morning, I woke in Roman's arms, my head resting on the solid curve of his bicep, his breathing steady and warm against the memories of a night I never believed I would live through. But a few hours later, that fragile peace shattered as if it had never existed at all. I was preparing Gloria's morning medication when the phone in my coat pocket buzzed. A message from an unknown number. The first 3 words froze my blood. "We know where you are." I stopped mid-movement, my pulse crashing painfully against my ribs. Another message came through, colder than winter air slipping under the cottage door. "If you want your family in Seattle alive, you know what to do." My hands shook. I called my mother, no answer. My younger brother, nothing. My cousin, straight to voicemail. A cold sweat broke across the back of my neck, even though my body felt feverish. Then the third message arrived, the one that turned my knees to water. "We know you're hesitating, so here is the final offer. You have 1 hour to leave the DeLuca estate. Abandon them. If you are still by Roman's side at sunset, your family in Seattle dies. Leave him alone, and we spare them." For a second, the room tilted. I looked at Gloria, sitting peacefully in her armchair, morning light softening her features, her smile gentle as she laughed with Maria over a few spilled drops of tea. A kind woman, a grateful woman, someone who had trusted me more intimately than most patients I had ever cared for, and someone they wanted me to kill. Not by neglect, not indirectly, but with my own hands, the same hands that had pressed life back into her chest the night she collapsed. I staggered back, fingers white around the clipboard. That was when Roman appeared in the doorway, just as I tried to turn away. He saw it instantly, whatever crack had opened inside me. His gaze locked onto mine, sharp and searching. Leighton, what happened? I opened my mouth, but my throat squeezed shut. I had never felt so trapped, caught between terror, love, duty, and the kind of danger that didn't leave room for mistakes. I couldn't tell him. If I did, he would become a storm I couldn't stop. I couldn't stay silent. My family's lives hung in the balance, and lying to him was impossible. He always saw straight through me. I only managed 3 words, flat and brittle. I need air. I walked out too fast, almost stumbling straight to the cottage. The door had barely closed before my legs buckled. I slid down against the wall, hands over my mouth to muffle the sob that clawed up my chest. I wasn't a panicker. I didn't fall apart easily. But right then, it felt like the ground had opened beneath me. I grabbed my phone again, fingers shaking so hard I almost dropped it. Another message had arrived. You have 7 days. We watch every day. Tell Roman. And one of them dies first. I pressed the cold screen to my forehead. The chill felt like the edge of the blade that had once rested against my skin. They knew me. They knew exactly where to cut. They knew that my greatest weakness wasn't fear, it was compassion. And the worst part was that they understood something even deeper. I would never hurt Gloria. Not for anything. Not for anyone. Not even for my family. Panic tightened around my lungs. I bent forward, gripping the edge of the table just to stay upright. I had never felt so small, so helpless, so cracked open. And underneath all the terror was something sharper, crueler guilt. Because last night, I had let myself fall into Roman's arms. I had let him into a part of me I'd kept locked away my entire life. And now a single message had twisted that into a weapon aimed straight at the people I loved. I sank onto the edge of the bed, my hands covering my face. For the first time since stepping into this estate, I felt completely, terrifyingly breakable under the weight closing in around me. I knew that if Roman saw me like this, he wouldn't leave anyone alive who dared breathe my name. And because I knew that, because his love was as destructive as it was protective, I felt even more desperate. I couldn't tell him. I couldn't betray him. But I couldn't let my family die. That was the moment I finally understood what it meant to collapse. Not crying, not falling apart. Collapse was realizing that no matter which direction you chose, you would lose a piece of your heart forever. I packed my things in silence, every movement trembling just enough to feel as if the entire decision might collapse if I breathed too hard. Everything inside the cottage still carried traces of Roman from the night before. His jacket draped over the chair, the half-empty glass of water he'd left beside my bed, the warm, unmistakable scent of him woven into the pillowcase. All of it felt like invisible hands tugging at me, pulling me backward, but the message on my phone was still there, cold as a blade pressed directly against my heart. They would kill my family, they would kill Gloria, and they would use me to drag Roman into a war he would never walk out of. I knew I had to leave. Not because I was afraid fear was only a piece of it, but because I loved them too much to be the reason they shattered. I zipped the suitcase, pulled it toward the door, and wrapped my fingers around the handle. Before I could turn it, the door swung open. Roman stood there. No warning, no knock, just him tall, dark, unmovable, filling the doorway with a presence that made the entire room feel too small to breathe in. His gaze dropped to the suitcase, then to my shaking hand. Only one question left his chest, low and edged like steel. "What are you doing?" I swallowed, fighting for steady ground. "I have to go." He stepped forward, his shadow spilling across the room like an eclipse. "Why?" I backed up half a step, but he followed, close enough that I could feel his breath brush my lips. I tried to lie, but the words cracked. "I looked at the blood on your hands yesterday, Roman." I lied, my voice shaking with a cruelty I didn't feel. And I realized I can't do this. I am a doctor. I save lives. You end them. I thought I could handle your world, but I was wrong. I don't just want to leave. I want to be as far away from you as possible. The words hit him like physical blows. I saw the light in his eyes shatter, replaced by the old, cold walls slamming back into place. He didn't know I was breaking my own heart to save his. If I told him the truth that I was leaving to protect my family, he would burn the world down, and my brother would be the first casualty. I had to make him let me go. Roman released my wrists slowly, his expression turning into a mask of ice. "So, last night meant nothing. Last night was a mistake," I whispered, dying inside. Roman looked at me for a long, long moment, so long I felt it carve into me. Then he whispered, almost as if it was the truth he'd spent years refusing to admit. "You're leaving because you care, and that's what scares me the most." I gathered every shred of courage I had left and gently pulled his hand away from my face. My fingers were shaking so badly I could barely grip the suitcase handle, but I turned, and I walked. I didn't look back, because if I did, I wouldn't leave. As I stepped out of the cottage, I heard Roman say my name, not loud, not furious, just broken, heavy, like his heart was tearing open. But I kept going. I had to protect him, protect Gloria, protect my family, even if it meant ripping myself apart. I climbed into the taxi, the door closed, and as the car rolled away from the DeLuca estate, I pressed a shaking hand over my chest, where my heart felt like it had been crushed in a single fist. I wasn't running away to hide. I was complying with their demands to buy my family time. As soon as I was clear of the gates, I would find a way to save them myself. I had to be the one to fix this, even if it meant Roman would hate me for the rest of his life. Roman needed less than 2 days to trace every thread I had tried to hide. He didn't accept my disappearance the way an ordinary man would endure a separation. He didn't sleep, didn't eat, didn't leave Long Island unless absolutely necessary, and the news spread through the underworld like the opening beat of a war drum. When the man behind the threats was dragged from Seattle to New York and tied to a chair in the dark room beneath the DeLuca estate, I was sitting on an old bus with my hands trembling as Maria's message appeared on my phone. Just 4 words that shattered the breath in my chest. "Roman knows everything now." I shot to my feet immediately. I didn't think. I didn't gather my things. I simply threw myself into the nearest taxi and ordered the driver back to Long Island, my heart pounding so fast it felt like a physical wound splitting open inside me. I knew what Roman would do. I knew how his eyes changed when someone touched a person he loved. I knew what that basement room could become, the tomb of anyone foolish enough to harm him or those he claimed. And I couldn't let that happen because of me. When I approached the gates, the guards recognized me instantly. No questions, no hesitation. They opened the gate as if my presence alone explained everything. I ran across the cold stone corridor, my footsteps echoing like frantic heartbeats. I heard screaming from the lower level, a raw, guttural sound that curled around the edges of the hall like smoke. I sprinted down the stairs and burst through the metal door. Roman stood in the center of the room. His face was so dark, so stripped of humanity, that I barely recognized him. His eyes were bottomless, cold, razor-sharp, pulsing with a kind of primal fury that made the air itself feel thinner. The man tied to the chair was gasping, blood streaking down his shirt, shaking with terror. Roman turned when he heard me, and in that instant, the whole room seemed to stop breathing. "Leighton." His voice was low, ragged, as if torn from hours of barely contained rage. I stepped forward, chest tight, breath shattering painfully inside me. Roman moved toward me, the storm still flickering inside his eyes. "You shouldn't be here." I drew in a slow breath and forced my voice to hold steady. "I have to be here, because if I'm not, you'll do something you can't come back from." Roman stared at me, and for the first time since I'd known him, his eyes weren't walls of stone. They were fire. They were grief. They were fear he no longer knew how to hide. "You think I care about him? He threatened you. He threatened your family. He wanted Gloria dead. And don't worry about Seattle, my men have already secured your family. They are safe. This filth has no leverage left. But he still threatened you." "I know," I said, softly but firmly. "And that's why I need to talk to you." His jaw clenched, his muscles tight with barely restrained violence, his gaze burning through me as if he wanted to tear apart the entire world just to keep me safe. "You left because of this, didn't you? Because you thought you had to protect everyone from me." I opened my mouth, but there was no denying it. Roman took another step, his breath hot with anger and something deeper. "You're wrong, Leighton. I'm not the danger. I'm the one keeping you alive. You don't need to protect the world from me. You need to protect me from myself." I gripped the edge of my sleeve, fighting to stay calm. "Roman, you can't kill someone because of me." He paused for one broken heartbeat, eyes darkening like something inside him was collapsing inward. Then he whispered, almost like a confession, "I can, and I will, if anyone touches you again." My breath caught. The look in his eyes tightened something deep inside my chest, a mix of fear, longing, and an ache so sharp it felt like a wound. I stepped closer, placing my hand over his chest, feeling his heart slam against my palm like a trapped animal fighting its cage. "If you do this, you'll lose yourself, and I don't want the man I love to become a monster for me." The words escaped before I could pull them back. Roman froze. In that moment, the darkness in his eyes flickered, and something else took its place. Pain. Hope. Something unbearably human. You love me enough to leave, to keep me safe. Tears burned the back of my throat. I left so no one would die. Roman raised his hand to my face, his fingers trembling almost imperceptibly as he lifted my chin. You think I'll let this world touch you again without consequence? I met his gaze, steadying myself, and said the one truth that silenced both of us. If you kill him, I'll leave you forever. The room went utterly still. Roman stared at me for a long, long moment, long enough that I felt the fury draining from his body piece by fragile piece. Finally, he turned to the man tied to the chair. His voice was cold enough to freeze bone. Release him, but make sure he never steps foot in this city again. His men obeyed instantly. When the door slammed shut behind them, Roman looked back at me. You just made me do something I've never done before. Spare a man who threatened everything I love. I stepped forward, pressing my hand to his chest again, feeling the thunder of his heartbeat easing beneath my fingertips, because you needed to know that real strength isn't in making people afraid of you. It's in choosing not to let the darkness swallow you whole. Roman lowered his forehead to mine, his breath trembling against my lips. And his voice, when it finally came, was softer than anything I had ever heard from him. I only become this man because of you. Roman stood motionless in front of me, one hand braced against the cold metal table, the other clenched so tightly the knuckles had turned white. The man who had held this world under his control for so long now looked as if one more word from me would either break him apart or ignite a fury that nothing could contain. I knew what I had said was the only thread keeping him from falling over the edge. He stared at me for a long time, his dark eyes tight with the kind of internal war that scraped bone. You really want me to spare him? I drew a shaky breath, though even breathing felt like a fragile act. Yes. Roman let out a short laugh, not a real laugh, but the sharp, disbelieving sound of a man who could not accept what he'd just heard. He threatened you, threatened your family, wanted my mother dead. He wanted to drag you into a war just to destroy me, and you want me to let him live? I stepped closer, placing my palm against his chest where his heartbeat slammed wildly beneath the fabric. I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm asking you not to ruin yourself over someone like him. Roman lowered his head until his forehead rested against mine, the moment stretched tight like wire. You don't understand, Leighton. No one in my entire life has ever threatened someone I love and survived. This isn't morality. This is principle. I cupped his face in both hands, forcing him to look directly at me. Exactly, Roman. And because of that principle, if you kill him, you will no longer be the man I love. That was the final blow. I saw it cut through him like an invisible blade. Roman blinked once, and for the first time, I saw real pain in his eyes. You love me enough to make me become better. His voice was rough, like someone gasping through their last breath. Not better, I corrected softly but firmly, enough that he stilled completely. Yourself, not the dark version the world shaped you into. Roman closed his hands around mine, bowing his head as if in prayer, or as if trying to swallow the fire burning inside him. The room was so silent I could hear the faint metallic drip of blood hitting the floor from the man tied to the chair. Finally, Roman turned, his broad shoulders tightening for a second before he spoke, his voice sharp as a blade but carrying a softness no one else on earth would ever hear. Release him. Get him out of the city immediately. If he ever comes back or speaks her name again, I won't show mercy. His men obeyed at once. The man was dragged out like a sack of grain, gasping, trembling like someone who had just been born again. The door slammed behind him, leaving Roman and me alone in a silence that pressed at the ribs. He stood still with his back to me, his entire body pulled taut like a wire drawn to its breaking point. I stepped closer and laid my hand gently on his back. His breath hitched. Roman turned, grabbed my hand, and pressed it against his heart. You just made me do something I've never done before. I looked up at him, and his eyes, those dark, endless eyes, were no longer only shadows. There was light in them now, a crack revealing the part of him he had spent a lifetime hiding. He continued, his voice dropping into a confession that seemed carved from the deepest part of him. You asked me to spare my enemy, and I did. Not because he deserves to live, but because you asked, because it mattered to you. I pressed my lips together, studying him. So, for the first time in your life, you chose mercy. Not for power, not for leverage, but for love. Roman lifted his hand to my cheek, touching me with a tenderness that made my chest tighten. Leighton, you are the first person who's ever made me want to become a different version of myself. Not for control, not for fear, but because I can't stand the thought of you walking away from me ever again. I stepped into his arms and rested my head against his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat, still strong, still fierce, but no longer wild. In that moment, I knew something irreversible had happened between us. This wasn't just a confession, not just a shift in power, or emotion, or desire. It was the first time Roman DeLuca chose mercy over violence. The first time he placed love above dominance. The first time he allowed me to touch the most fragile part of him, and didn't pull away. It was the point of no return, not just for him, but for me. I left the basement with legs that no longer felt like they belonged to me, not from fear, not from tension, but from the weight of what had just passed between Roman and me, heavier than any war I had ever witnessed. I followed the stone path back toward the cottage, the golden lights stretching across the lawn like thin ribbons cutting through the dark. The closer I came, the harder my heart pounded, as if it already knew what waited for me. When I stepped onto the porch, Roman was standing at the door, not with the commanding, untouchable posture he wore like armor, but like an ordinary man with his hands tucked into his pockets, his shoulders drawn tight, his gaze softened into something so gentle it made me stop. He didn't speak at first. He simply looked, as though he needed to be certain that I was real, that I was truly in front of him, that I hadn't disappeared again, that his world hadn't fallen apart. I drew a deep breath and moved toward him. Roman slipped his hands from his pockets, closing the space between us with only 2 steps. But those 2 steps were enough for his warmth to reach me. "Leighton," he said, his voice low, not the voice he used to command or threaten, but the voice of a man learning how to confess for the first time. "You did what I asked, and I know you didn't do it because you were afraid of me. You did it because you want me to be the man worthy of what you feel for me." I lifted my hand and rested it against his chest, where his heart beat strong and steady. "I'm not trying to change you, Roman. I just want the good in you to survive." Roman caught my hand and brought it to his lips, pressing a slow, deep kiss into my palm, as if sealing a vow meant only for me. He held my gaze for a long moment before whispering words that felt both heavy and painfully true. "I love you, Leighton Hayes." My heart tightened and opened at the same time, not because I didn't know, not because I hadn't felt it, but because hearing him say it shifted the very color of my world. I touched his cheek, my voice trembling but firm. "I love you too. Not because you're powerful, not because you saved me, but because you let me see the part of you you've hidden from everyone else." Roman pulled me into his arms, holding me tight enough that I knew if he let go even for a breath, he feared he'd lose me again. His breath warmed my neck, not the breath of a storm, but the warmth of someone who had finally found where he belonged. I don't know how long we stood there, maybe a few seconds, maybe a lifetime. When we finally stepped inside, the cottage light brushed soft shadows across Roman's face, making his eyes look as though they held the whole night inside them. But before he could pull me closer, a gentle voice floated from the path leading back to the main house. "You two finally decided to say it." Gloria stood there, wrapped in a shawl, her face bright with a smile I had never seen shine so beautifully. I stepped back in surprise, but she was already moving toward me, arms open. I didn't have time to speak before she pulled me into an embrace warm enough to break me apart, the kind of embrace a mother gives a daughter she has been waiting years to love. "My girl, I've waited so long for this." My throat tightened and tears rose before I could stop them. Gloria stroked my hair, then glanced at Roman with a look that was half scolding, half tender. "She's finally come back. If you let her leave again, I'll drag you outside myself." Roman bowed his head slightly, the corner of his mouth lifting into a rare smile. A smile meant only for his mother and for this moment. I had never seen that expression on him. No darkness, no anger, just a fragile, genuine happiness. Gloria held me once more before letting go. "Stay, dear. This is your home." I looked at Roman. He didn't speak. He simply took my hand and gave it a gentle squeeze, not a command, not a claim, but an invitation filled with quiet devotion. And in that moment, I knew I had come back. Not just to the cottage, not just to Long Island, but to the place where my heart belonged, where Roman stood, where Gloria welcomed me, and where the future no longer felt like something I had to fear. Leighton woke each morning in the small cottage tucked deep in the garden behind the DeLuca estate, where the first light slipped through wooden window frames and the Long Island sea breeze moved in rhythm with her breath. Her life no longer resembled the one she once knew, yet strangely, it no longer frightened her. She still worked as a doctor, still used her hands and her heart to keep people alive, but now she did it beside those she once believed were nothing but danger. Gloria was her patient. Yes, but she was also the mother she'd never had. Every morning, Gloria waited in her armchair by the living room window, while Leighton brought her medicine, checked her pressure, and asked about every small change. Leighton called it routine. Gloria called it living one more day to see you happy. That sentence always softened Leighton's breath. But the greater change was Roman. He was still the man the underworld feared, still the name that made people swallow hard before speaking. Yet here, among walls covered in ivy, he was a man learning something he had never learned before: how to slow down. He came home earlier. The meetings that once stretched past midnight ended when the sun fell. He no longer stationed guards at the cottage door like she was a treasure meant to be locked away. He no longer entered her life like a storm. He stood beside her like a stone she could lean on when she needed to steady herself. Once, while she was sorting Gloria's medication, she noticed Roman leaning against the doorway, his shirt sleeves rolled, his tie loose, his gaze softened in a way that felt impossibly gentle. "Do you need anything?" he asked, the same way he asked every day, as if practicing a habit he wanted to get right. At first she said no, and he nodded and left. But slowly, she began to say yes. "Yes, I need you to hand me that bottle. Yes, I'd like you to stay for a bit. Yes, tell me about your day, even the dark parts." And he did. Not everything, but enough for her to know he was trying. Their life wasn't perfectly peaceful, yet somehow they found peace in the mess. Between Gloria's checkups, encrypted calls from Manhattan, and quiet dinners shared in the cottage kitchen, they built a rhythm neither of them had known before. One night, rain tapping softly at the windows, Leighton sat in the living room reading patient files when Roman walked in, unannounced, his leather jacket damp, hair slightly tousled. She looked up and frowned at the thin scratch on his wrist. Again, she set the file down and moved toward him. He tried to hide it, but she caught his hand, examining the dried red line. "Nothing serious," he said first, voice steady but eyes avoiding hers. "You know how it is, someone always wants to test how long it takes me to snap." "And tonight?" she asked quietly. Roman gave a brief smile, small but enough to loosen the tension. "Less than usual, because I knew you were waiting here." Leighton's heart pulled tight, not because his words were beautiful, but because they were true. He sat, letting her bandage the small wound. Each time her fingers brushed his skin, his breathing slowed, as if he had to steady himself not to pull her closer. When she finished, Roman caught her wrist and tugged gently so she sat beside him. "You make me want to stay calm. You make me want to control myself. You make me want to live longer, slower." Each word reached the guarded place inside her, but what moved her most was how softly he said them, as if loving her was something he carried quietly. They didn't have perfect peace, but they had a new rhythm, one where darkness didn't swallow the light, where power wasn't a danger but something he learned to hold smaller because of her. Leighton still woke each morning to her work, still tended patients, still battled her inner storms. Roman still stepped into his violent world, still faced enemies, still built walls around those he loved. But when night fell, when only warm lamplight and their quiet breaths filled the cottage, they looked at each other and understood they were building something neither believed they would ever have. A life. A life built in the shadows, but a shadow they chose together. A life imperfect yet real. A life of peace inside the very storm they were learning to survive side by side. Night settled over Long Island, in that muted blue-violet haze between summer and early fall. And from the highest balcony of the DeLuca estate, all of Manhattan shimmered like an artificial Milky Way stretched to the edge of the horizon. Leighton stood beside Roman, her hands resting on the cool stone railing as the sea salt wind lifted her hair. Across the dark water, the city that never slept pulsed with its restless life, distant horns, blinking lights, and the quiet hum of a world too large to ever fully understand. Roman stood close, no longer guarded the way he once was. The glow from the city softened the sharp lines of his face, washing away the shadows that had long defined him. For a long moment he said nothing, as if each breath had to be weighed before he let it go. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, not the menacing rumble that once made enemies flinch, but a confession pulled from somewhere private. "You changed everything." Leighton turned to him, her eyes reflecting both the skyline and the man beside her. She didn't smile, but her gaze warmed. "I didn't change everything. You allowed yourself to." Roman shook his head slightly, as though he wanted to argue but couldn't. He looked back toward Manhattan, and for the first time she saw how his shoulders had eased, how the weight he once carried like armor had slipped just enough for the light to reach him. Once, he believed power required a frozen heart, but the moment she saved his mother, his world cracked open, and he let the light through those cracks without even knowing it. Leighton looked out toward the glowing towers. Love didn't save us, but it made the war worth fighting. Roman didn't answer immediately. Her words sank into the place he hid from everyone, the place where fear and tenderness lived side by side. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. "A year ago," he said, "if someone told him he'd stand here with a woman he didn't need to control, but simply hoped would choose to stay, he would have laughed. But now everything he thought he knew felt unsteady in the best possible way." Leighton traced the horizon with her eyes, where the sky and the city blended without a clean seam. She didn't know what their future would look like. The darkness was still there. Roman's world would always be threaded with danger, with choices sharp enough to cut. She wasn't certain she was ready for all of it forever. But she knew this. Neither of them was fighting alone anymore. Neither of them was running. And most importantly, neither of them feared what they felt. Roman lifted his hand not to command, not to take, but simply to offer. She placed hers in it, light yet sure. Warmth moved from his palm to her chest, a reminder that peace wasn't the absence of storms. It was finding the right person to stand beside while they rose around you. In the distance, Manhattan glowed on a reminder that the world is always a blend of beauty and risk. But tonight, in the quiet between two people who had survived their own darkness, they found a kind of peace neither thought they would ever touch. And so this story closes with a simple truth. Love isn't always the miracle that saves us, but it is often the reason we become brave enough to fight for something better. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of choices, sacrifices, or moments of courage in your own life, I would love to hear your thoughts. Please share your feelings in the comments. Your voice matters deeply to us. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share so you can join us each day for more heartfelt, inspiring stories. Thank you for spending your time with us. Wishing you health, peace, and gentleness in every day ahead. We'll see you in the next video.